questionnaire is really going to test your brain power here, because we're going to ask some tough questions about the future of advertising, the future of marketing, and indeed also the future of the media. The Schumpeter Questionnaire is a reference to the Schumpeter column that we have in The Economist each week, which takes on the big management issues of the day. But obviously it got its name from Joseph Schumpeter, the legendary economist, who came up with this concept of creative destruction and saw innovation as being driven by these waves of creative destruction where incumbents get knocked out and new firms emerge and so forth. And I wonder, if you look at your industry, Miles, how is this extraordinary creative destruction wave affecting the industry now? How far is it along the process of reinvention for the digital era?
Well, first of all, thank you for your gross flattery. And by the way, thank anyone who's here for staying, because hopefully you won't look out of the window and realize how dire the conditions are. I think the creative destruction in our industry, honestly, can be symbolized by the destruction or removal from primacy of the 30-second TV spot. And that is not to say that it's the same as the destruction or removal of television. I think we heard a little bit about that this morning. Of course, it's very convenient for those who are selling digital media to claim that television is dying or on its way out. It's proven very resilient and adaptive. But the 30-second television spot is gone. Now, actually, David Ogilvy, whom you referenced, would have been very pleased to hear that. Because as I remember him in his latter years, quite old, but nonetheless quite radical, he was vigorously opposed to the tyranny of the 30-second TV spot. And in fact, in our agency, he really espoused the cause of direct marketing. Interesting enough, when he retired to Paris, he refused to have his desk in the advertising agency. He had it in what was then Ogilvy One, as a matter of principle. But what it means is this: that for a long time, communications could be neatly packaged into certain forms. 30-second TV spot, a direct mail shot, an ad shell poster, whatever. And that's the way in which everyone thought, marketeers and advertising people. And now you can't say it's like that. It's become formless, or if you want a nicer word, it's become seamless. There are no boundaries. Everything is fluid. As one of our clients described it, it's liquid and linked, or should be liquid and linked. So this is what you might call the real impact of the digital revolution. It's difficult to discern for a while what that was, but it is this creation of this whole world of content that is seamless. Now, content itself is not an easy word. It's a horrible word.
This is a pretty horrible word.
And it can be quite horrible. And actually, I think there are 27 million pieces of content put onto the internet every day. And only 67% of content that's put out is 67% is not actually read. So there's a jumble of content. That's the destruction. The creative part of the destruction is to create content that's usable, interesting, that people interact with and that people want. To answer your question, after rather a convoluted digression, I think that we're becoming much more like publishers, actually, both clients and agencies. We're becoming more like you, not competitors of you, but we're becoming more like you, and we have to behave more like you.
So, as you look at the advertising industry, I mean, how far have the firms in the industry, including yours, actually, restructured themselves and recreated themselves to be that new form of advertising?
The honest answer is not very far. Mm-hmm. And I think there is also still quite a lot of denial, in truth, about this. But we have to move in that direction. So there are all sorts of things which have made it difficult. For instance, there's been a balkanization of our industry as a result of the digital revolution. So you start to have a whole phenomenon of pure plays and so on and so forth. That in itself makes seamlessness something quite difficult to strive for. But fundamentally, I don't think the complete mindset change has happened yet. So the mindset change is this: is we have to move from being agents, which is effectively what we were before, agents of media owners producing creativity, to being publishers of content. And that means having an editorial mindset. You know what that is. But clients and agencies haven't had an editorial mindset particularly. Now, to be blunt, there aren't enough editors around. So we are very much wanting to develop our business in this way. It means hiring editors and curators and journalists, people who traditionally haven't worked in our agency.
And who would regard, in some ways, going to work for an agency as going to the dark side?
Satan's work,
yes.
Definitely, yes.
So how would you take, is it Satan's work, or is there some new form? I mean, how do you, if you're driving the traditional media, I mean, if you take the traditional media business model, newspaper business model, relied on your agency function and relied on the reader having a clear sense of, what was advertising and what was editorial content. And now that all seems to become a bit of a jumble. I mean, do you think that we're going to come out of that with a clear sense of what is advertising and what is editorial, or is that now going to be forever a sort of rather
I personally
unsatisfactory jumble?
I don't think it should be an unsatisfactory jumble. I absolutely strongly believe that it should always be very clear whom the material comes from. And if it's paid and owned material, then I think people need to know who's paid for it and who owns it. But I don't think that stops journalists doing great journalism. And after all, journalists have always been paid by publishers anyway. And those publishers have often had quite controversial points of view. And yet journalists have always been prepared to carry on working.
But I think it would be fair to say that for traditional brands, putting up with the uppity journalist writing the snarky comments about their clients was something you put up with because you needed to get to the readers. And I guess on the journalistic side, people now say, well, if they don't have to go through us to get to the ultimate customer, then maybe our business model doesn't work anymore. Yeah. So maybe we go away and you just have this direct connection with the viewer, with the reader. Is that your ideal?
No, I don't think so. I think everyone needs content in some kind of ecosystem. So your magazine is a fantastic example of, in my view, of well-managed, well-produced and well-researched content. And you've never run away from the need to invest in the large salaries that are necessary to produce that sort of content.
If only.
I mean, others in your sector have done that, and they've suffered as a result. And as Gertrude Stein said, there's no there. But I think there will be a market for content in different forms. Now, all that content that's unreadable and uninteresting is waste. So we're talking about useful content, and the great benefit of the internet is that you vote with your fingers, and it's measurable. And if people don't want to read it, they won't read it, and you'll know. So I feel quite positive about this. But all I'm saying is that I'm not convinced that brands can't be publishers. They can be, and they should be, and that is the big dividend of the digital revolution.
And do you feel your clients now understand that, and that's what they're asking from you? They're asking for you to help them publish who they are to a readership?
I do.
Or are they still
I think I think every single client we have is talking about content right now.
And where do you see that heading in 5 years? I mean, is there going to be a very different sort of standard product that will emerge to replace the 30-second ad, or is it more and more?
No, well, let's be
diverse?
clear. The 30-second ad may disappear as a vehicle, but the idea, the creative idea or the communications idea, becomes even more important in this world. So in a world where you're suffering from a vast oversupply of information and what one sociologist called meaning lag, which is just so difficult to create meaning out of so many different inputs. You need some creative organizing system which draws it together. So the role of the big creative idea to use those old-fashioned sounding words, actually becomes much more important than it ever did. So if you take, let's take IBM as an example, the idea Smarter Planet, or the brand platform Smarter Planet, becomes an organizing principle for a great deal of content. You had BlackRock up here earlier. They've got an organizing idea as well. So ideas are more, not less important in this new world, which is why sometimes people get it wrong, because a lot of the debate is about technology and data. It's very, very important, but at root, what differentiates brands is the idea, which is turned based on the point of view of the brand.
And I mean, one of the themes that you see emerging now is that we're shifting from a one-way push notion of the brand being designed by people like yourself and then pushed out there, to one where it's more of a conversation and engagement with the consumer and so forth. How does that change what it means to be a brand and what you have to do to be a successful brand?
I think it's a very positive development, and it's something we've always craved for. So the word interactive was always bandied around and was never really meaningful, and is now. But let's be clear: brands are brands, and they have to be tightly managed. So in the socialization of brand, actually, the management in a way has to become even tighter. Otherwise, it all starts to disintegrate. So we may want conversations, and we seek conversations, but they have also to be some extent on the brand's terms. The brand can't abdicate responsibility to its customers for defining itself.
Is there an example of that you could talk about?
Well, I think there are lots of examples where conversations get out of control, and the social discourse is therefore undermining often of the brand equity. So you just have to be mindful that in the public space, brands are also vulnerable as much as they are attractive.
So in the WPP report, you're quoted as saying to be a great brand, you have to be a social brand.
I think.
What did you mean by that specifically?
I think you've got to have some social currency and talkability, and I think you've got to have the ability to do it at scale. So a classic example of that probably would be Dove, and I think Mark Mathieu was here earlier today, and he's maybe gone now. But Dove is a brand which has, through its point of view about the importance of real beauty as opposed to contrived beauty, and the importance of realism in its communication, succeeded in generating a social conversation at a global level repeatedly over the course of the last 3 or 4 years, if it is stimulated by copy which is highly involving. If. And that's a big if. And it, by the way, it doesn't always work, and it's possible to predict which piece of copy will go hugely viral with some assuredness beforehand. But that's a very, very good example. So Dove has become socialized more than its competitors, and you can see the benefit of that in its business performance very, very clearly, and also in the degree of bonding which it generates amongst its users.
But I mean, it's interesting how few brands have done as well as Dove at doing that.
Yes, I don't think. I have to say, I don't think it's easy. I don't think it's easy, and we're dealing with an audience that is difficult to predict. Well, let's put it this way: you can put a scowling cat on the internet, and you will get views. But to do it with a subtle, complex, and very carefully organized brand is another thing altogether. It's not always highly predictive.
You mentioned Grumpy Cat, and I mean, I wonder when you look at BuzzFeed or you look at Vice, which have elements of advertising right at their core, but also some media
Yeah.
in traditional media. What do you learn from them? What do you make of
What we learn from them, what are millennial audiences like, and by the way, I think they're often right. I mean, it's what you can get there is highly entertaining. We learn the power of some things like irreverence, like informality of communication, like original ways of thinking, and those all inform the creative process. I think if you were to talk to our creative people, they'd find Vice one of the most stimulating sources that they have, and it was one of the best investments Martin made.
But equally, they've also added a media, traditional news hunting element to that. I mean, is that something that
I think
expect to see other advertising agencies?
I think when you start talk about content, there is a news angle to content, I think that for instance, we have a newsroom now built into our creative departments in some of our larger offices. So news itself becomes part of the publishing.
And what is that, and how would that differ from a conventional newsroom?
It wouldn't. It's exactly the same, but its purpose is different. Its purpose is to produce or to obtain or to curate news that in some way is relevant to that brand's positioning or platform. So it's filtering news.
You spent a lot of time in Asia, probably still do, but you were there for many years running the business. What is it that you see as you look at Asian advertising and Asian brands that we should be in America worried about or learning from?
Well, I think you mentioned Schumpeter, and the other Schumpeter sort of theory that sticks is the theory of invention, innovation, imitation. Yes, and I think that they're good at all three. Conventionally, it's always been assumed they're good at imitation. But they're very, very good, I think, now at invention and at innovation. So if we look at Chinese brands, maybe as one of the newer sets of brands that are starting to go global, I believe they will be formidable competitors. Now, the speed of that process of Chinese brands going into the outside world was always oversold and overhyped, particularly by the Chinese, because they had a national agenda of creating 10 global brands by the year 2000. And I think 2012 we actually passed it. And of course it's an interesting journalistic copy as well. But so it's slower than anticipated, but it's absolutely happening. And we're working with 2 or 3 of them. They will be very, very strong competitors where they're allowed to compete. And because they're not always allowed to compete freely. So a brand like Huawei is severely curtailed, as you know here. I think then you've got another type of Asian company or brand which you can perhaps call pro-neural. I think the term is pro-neural, yes, sort of entrepreneurial but professional. In India, we're seeing some of these. Pidilite is a good one, and interesting enough, the head of Mondelez's global chocolate business has just left or resigned to go to be the new head of Pidilite. His ambition is to turn it into a global brand. I think we can also see some interesting brands coming out of Indonesia and some of the other Asian countries. So it's going to be more of a two-way flow. I think in the area of technology platforms, WeChat will strongly come into the West. It's already in South Africa. It's a superior platform, actually.
Well, tell us what it does.
Well, it's Twitter meets WhatsApp meets a payment system, and we can see it now in South Africa. I think it went into South Africa first. It probably has a market share, 14-15%, maybe higher, after a very short period of time. So the idea that the way in which people consume their social media is going to be the way that America consumes its social media is probably a false one. You've got Baidu going into Brazil. So these Chinese technology platforms are actually superior, probably, to their Western counterparts. and they're coming west. So in a way, they'll probably be the first sort of interface. Jack Ma's already here that people will have. But it's not just Asian brands. I would say in Latin America, you've got some very interesting brands. Bimbo in Mexico is definitely a brand of the future. It's just one example.
So we're almost out of time, but if you had to sort of give one piece of advice to this audience about what they should be focusing on in particular over the next 12 months to really get on top of the changes that are happening, to be at the cutting edge, what would be the one piece of advice you would give?
Well, that's a very difficult question, but I think it would be to sit down for a few hours and try to put on paper what one's content strategy was. I think everyone's got a marketing strategy, got a communication strategy, overarching, what a digital strategy, but what is your content strategy, and what types of content do you want to produce, and what are the objectives of that strategy, and how is it going to be measured, and whom is it going to be targeted to? I've talked a little bit about content, but it's something that breaks down into various different typologies, and I think it's often a blanket term. So when people talk about it, they don't really define what it is. So I think a few hours spent just brainstorming what the role of content in the organisation is and how one can create content that's useful probably would be the best single thing that one can do.